seek to prove to you today why we believe it is important for the Hagia Sophia to be returned to its form that it was present in the year 537 AD. And the manner in which we seek to do this is first analyze for you why we believe the Eastern Roman Church, being the Orthodox Church, necessarily required the Hagia Sophia to be their symbol, and why we believe that the ransacking of this and plastering over was necessarily a political move. And we talk to you then about modern Turkey and the way we see the growing sphere of Islamization of that state, and why we believe that necessarily negates the very idea of Turkey being a model state, and therefore we believe our move to serve far more than a symbolic function, but a function to show that Turkey can take upon itself the burden of being a model state. But first, an understanding of the Eastern Roman Church is crucial in this debate. In the year 300 AD, we saw the Eastern Roman Church break off from the rest of Christianity, fundamentally because it believed that there were certain things that it could not necessarily coalesce with in terms of an ideology. And therefore we see in today's period, there are many members of the Orthodox Church that don't even celebrate Christmas. And therefore there necessarily exists a deep chasm between the Orthodox Church and the rest of Christianity. And we see therefore the consequent importance of the Hagia Sophia to this church was that they coalesced around the church, around Hagia Sophia, where it was an architectural marvel for the Eastern Roman Church, and was therefore hugely significant for them as a religious monument. I mean, simply comparable to the Golden Temple for Sikhs today. And therefore we see that around the Hagia Sophia, the Orthodox Christians used to construct their own myths about its divine origin, about the divine origin of the Christ. And therefore we see all the artwork present in the Hagia Sophia was an extension of this symbolism, of the significance of the Hagia Sophia. And therefore in the year 1236, it is important for us to note that when the church was taken over, it was not done to appease the religious or the spiritual being of Islam. It was done as a purely political move, saying that we can take what you cherish the most, and while we will not destroy it completely, it will stand as a testament to our dominance over you. And therefore we see that there is a clear distinction that can be drawn between the Hagia Sophia and the Dome of the Rock, in Jerusalem, right? In that the Dome of the Rock, there are clear theological claims over the rock by both Islam and by Christians. But that's not true for the Hagia Sophia. We see there being a clear demarcation of the religious significance of the Hagia Sophia, and the fact that the Muslims or the Islamist leaders of that time took it over as a necessarily political move, as an exercise of dominance. And therefore we see that merely plastering over, if this is a line that side opposition will seek to take, merely plastering over is not enough, because what we understood this to mean was simply an extension of that domination, and the fact that if they did destroy it, it would not stand as a testament to Muslim dominance in Turkey. Which leads me to my second principle of what happened to Turkey or the Turkish region from the year 1236 to when Ataturk came to power. What we saw was a wide-scale understanding that Islam was really the only legitimate religion, in that while we are saying that there was certain oppression of Christians and that while there was scuttling of minorities, the more important aspect of this debate was simply that Islam became the only legitimate form of faith. And we see that when we understand that the political and religious leaders of Turkey were the same person, and therefore there was pervading Islamic influence across the state, right? And therefore we understand why is this dominance bad, right? Because we think that this analysis is required in this debate, because we think that as long as there is a class of people that have pervasive political influence, that have pervasive societal influence, we think that minorities do necessarily suffer, and that is hugely problematic. Which takes me to an understanding of why Ataturk's concept of secularism was extremely important. We believe that he took upon himself and his government the positive obligation to negate the influence that Islam had over Turkey, as opposed to simply an Indian understanding of secularism where you allow everyone to be. We think that this positive obligation necessarily required the state of Turkey to negate the sort of dominance that Islam had over Turkish society at that time. And we see this being furthered by the idea of Erdogan post the failure of this secular agenda. We see Erdogan, particularly after the year 2000, just give me 40 more seconds, particularly after the year 2000, where there has been increasing intolerance, there has been increasing Islamization of the Turkish discourse, which we think is hugely problematic. And therefore, what does our move do, Mr. Speaker? We think that first, it needs to show a tangible departure from Muslim dominance in Turkish society. We think that it allows the legitimacy to Christianity, which it was robbed of in the 6th century, and we think that that is extremely important. I'm going to highlight more benefits after this POI.
Okay, sir. If it has existed as a museum for a significant period of time, tell me how this cultural significance or this religious significance still operates in the recent memory of modern day Turkey.
I got it. Now the distinction needs to be understood between what does a museum represent and what does a religious symbol like the Golden Temple, like the Hagia Sophia, like the Vatican represent. What we think it represents is hugely symbolic in that a museum is devoid of any sort of religious inkling. What we think the Hagia Sophia represented was the Orthodox Church's understanding of Christianity, their understanding of what it meant to be Christian. And we think that therefore Islamic dominance over this was necessarily took away the legitimacy of Christianity, which could not really have been countered by simply making it a museum available to all at the price of a ticket. What do we see the role of Turkey as being in the 21st century? And we fundamentally have come to understand that Turkey has essentially become a model Islamic state, in that we see that there is allowance of liberal discourse, there is an allowance of religious freedom, and we don't see that as being the dominion of any other Middle Eastern or dominantly Islamic country. And we see that therefore Turkey has an important role to play as a model state, and we see our move as essentially furthering this objective of Turkey being or furthering Ataturk's idea of positive secularism in terms of allowing positive obligations upon the state to protect freedoms and to take away undue dominance. And with that, in my remaining 30 seconds, in terms of the summary of what we think opposition case will be, we think that what they're going to argue is that it's all right for this to have been taken over. We think that the Christians gained legitimacy over this because of the fact that it pervaded as a museum. What we have countered this with is an understanding of the significance of the Hagia Sophia, an understanding that this was a purely political move, an understanding of the role that this played in Turkish society over the next 800 years, and why we think this serves Turkey's role as a model Islamic state.
Mr. Speaker, we love the fact that they've come and told us that their aspiration is to ensure that Turkey continues down the line of being a model state, and they define the idea of a model state as one where, despite Islam being the dominant religion, they are necessarily tolerant to all other religions such as Christianity and other religions, right? We love it that when they tell us that since Christians are an integral part of this, it is important to necessarily preserve what is in fact their cultural past. But it is important to answer in fact what the modern day Christian living in this Turkish model state perceives to be his cultural past. We believe, and we clash directly with their characterization of what in fact affects a modern day Christian, when we tell you that a modern day Christian does not identify himself as one of the Christians that existed when the Eastern Roman Church broke away from the Orthodox Church and the symbolism that it held at that point in time. We believe that the robbing of the Christian identity vis-a-vis Sultan Mehmet's conquest is a part of the identity of the modern day Christian, right? And we believe this itself has its inherent value, and this itself is part of the cultural past for a modern day Christian. We believe that removing this particular process has far more harms, removing or breaking or removing this entire chain of events that has led to the Christian that lives in modern Turkey to identify himself as a cosmopolitan, like Christian in himself, where his religion does not necessarily identify, he does not identify with his religion as a major aspect of who he is as a Turkish citizen is very, very important. We clash with them when they tell us that Christians feel like that even today. We believe they don't. We believe not taken. We believe that they necessarily identify with themselves as cosmopolitan Christians that today of which this art within this monument forms an integral part, right? We believe we've necessarily already dealt with the majority of the case when we told you this, right? But no, not taken. We tell you that coming to construction in our case, we tell you that this removal necessarily has the first ramification, which is a sense of cultural ownership, right? We believe that giving this museum a place of neutral identity to a modern Turkish citizen today gives it a sense of cultural ownership, which is a bad thing, right? Because we believe that the conglomeration of both Islamic calligraphy, along with certain Christian art within the new monument, itself pervades, itself is symbolic of what the Christian state aspires to be, as the government itself has told us today, right? And we believe that removing this particular process is detrimental to that development of identity that has occurred, right? We tell you that now you've attached connotations of cultural ownership to this. When they come and tell us that they necessarily want the Christians to somehow gain some form of redemption, we tell you that they reignite situations of the past that are currently not actually issues of conflict in culture, or issues of cultural conflict in today's society. We believe by taking this move, you are not refreshing any memory, you are adding new, you are literally adulterating the memory or the recent memory of a modern Christian. We believe that this necessarily leads to, there has the probability of leading to far more conflict than it does in necessarily leading to some form of a cultural and historical redemption. We believe they must necessarily prove that to win that particular substantive, right? But we also tell you that it is important to analyze the role of this being art, right? And the interface between art and culture. We tell you that art in itself has this sort of like emotive response, right? And we believe that art in itself has its value. So when you necessarily destroyed the historical, or something that in art terms is known as the provenance of some particular form of art, we believe that you necessarily erase all links in the chain from which modern Turkish citizens learn from, right? And necessarily identify themselves with, right? And we believe that societies today use the past as a metric to decide how they wish to be as today's citizens, or how they wish to formulate policies for today, how they wish to address issues of secularism that may confront the modern Turkish citizenry today. And we believe when you remove all historical semblance of that, when you remove all traces of conquest, all traces of what that war symbolized, we believe that they do not have any record of that anymore. We believe that they've necessarily shot themselves in the foot if they necessarily undertake this move in terms of the symbolisms that they can learn from as a cultural state. Additionally, right, we've told you that war. Okay, I'll take you now.
So don't you believe the fact that there is a movement for the reclamation of the Hagia Sophia flies in the face of the fact that people don't care about its past?
We don't believe this is necessarily part of the fact scenario. Why not? And neither have the government told us in the first speech that it is necessarily an active Christian movement of theological origins that wants this necessarily like retracement of footsteps to what the Christians were. We believe that flies in the face of their entire case anyway, to come and say that is currently a model state and aspires to be a model state, but also has a great amount of religious turmoil and conflict. We think that's necessarily a dichotomy in that characterization. Additionally, we believe that having told you about harms such as cultural conflict and the symbolisms in the identity and the issues of identity that arise, we believe that as a neutral place of identity, it's very, very important to understand that there is a certain symbolism to both war and conquest, right? And the continuous flip-flopping of that within Turkey's history in itself. And we believe when you remove that, right, you've removed all necessary traces of what Turkish citizens can necessarily learn from. We believe that this not only highlights existing communal lines that may or may not exist today in the active political memory of Turkish citizens today, right? So what you're necessarily doing is regressing the active political memory of Turkish citizens in coming to such conclusions.
Sir, in an unequal sphere where in fact Christians have been discriminated against, is it enough to just be neutral? Should we not be proactive?
No. So this is the idea, right? To necessarily be proactive in this form, which is to use the modus operandi of removing art itself, does not cater to the needs of substantive equality, right? Which is essentially the form that he was necessarily trying to come to, that you have to substantively cater in terms of equality to the needs of both communities. We clash with that characterization that there is in fact such a dire need for substantive equality as there exists in other countries which are far more issues of minorities like India and other countries. But we believe that it's already on the path to its model state, and necessarily this art or this form of erasing art, because the very nature of art and its symbolic and emotional value is a way of overcompensating for what in fact is a turmoil that requires a proportionate response, right? We believe this form of cultural re-identification, this form of erasing existing memory and replacing it with which would be what is known as a manufactured memory for recent citizens, is in fact overcompensating in terms of issuing or bringing into public memory issues that they may or may not relate with. And we believe that has uncontrollable harms that both sides in this debate cannot identify but exist as a theoretical possibility. We believe that's something that side proposition has to include.
Mr. Speaker, today ISIS has control over a large chunk of territory, and what they're doing systematically is that they're destroying all other places of worship because they believe that Islam is dominant, and they believe that this dominance must be shown in tangible forms so that the Christians, the minority populations of these areas know who's boss, that they know that you are second-class citizens, and to be allowed to live here is something that Islam is doing as a favor to you. You pay us jizya, we allow you to live here, you are second-class citizens, and you should thank us for tolerating your religion. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to think that soon enough there will be a secular government in the territory that is now controlled by ISIS. We'd also like to think that this secular government will not remain neutral and say, no, we will not rebuild these places, but in fact, as a secular government, will take it upon itself to proactively be neutral. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if you claim to be secular, if you claim to be someone who believes in equality, it is not enough to merely remain neutral when there are tangible injustices, where there is the tangible decimation of culture of one particular community. Remember, this community has remained the minority community from the 13th century up till 1913. It was an unbroken dynasty. The Caliphate, Islam was the church and the state. The Caliph was the political leader as well as the religious leader, and Islam was clearly dominant. And then we saw Ataturk come up in 1913 with this very aggressive sort of secularization that we hadn't really seen before in this world. And this was exactly the sort of secularization this was exactly the sort of secularization that Turkey needed, where they were told that Islam didn't merely need to be controlled, it actually needed to be brought down a few pegs. That Islam's status actually had to be dissipated in order for Christianity, in order for other minorities to feel secure, and in order for Turkey to continue to be a secular state as Ataturk envisioned it. Right? Now, this idea that modern Christians don't care is ridiculous, because we know that people have a very strong bond to their religion, especially a religion like the Eastern Orthodox Church, which arguably is more religious than the Catholic Church. They are very devout, right? These people had a schism right in the beginning of the history of their church, and these ideas were so dear to them that they broke away from Rome and they created their Byzantine Empire, and the Hagia Sophia was the symbol and the center of the Byzantine Empire.
On that one.
No. This is why we compare it to something like, say, the Golden Temple or the Vatican. It is not merely a temple, it is the temple. It represents that faith, and these people still hold a lot of value for it. To merely say that a lot of time has passed and therefore people will not value that is ridiculous, because we see it across history. Religion still matters. There are so many sites in Jerusalem which are still contested, even though they are older than the Hagia Sophia mosque, right? So we're telling you that, of course, Christians do care, right? This idea that there is no cultural conflict currently in Turkey is also ridiculous, because Erdogan's government, the AK party, has one, been funding Muslim schools, two, been receiving support in the form of fatwas from the Orthodoxy. So it is clear that despite attempts at formal equality, substantive equality has not been achieved, and Islam continues to be dominant politically as well as in other ways.
Yeah.
Right? So the first thing that Turkey needs to do is accept that its secular experiment did not quite go as planned, and Ataturk's dream of having a nation where what religion you were didn't matter, and that was what he was aiming for. A nation where your religion did not matter. It is not a nation where your religion did not matter, because you are dominant if you are Muslim. Even if the laws do not make you dominant, the society is still structured in a manner which favors Muslim politics, right? Now, the importance of Turkey, and this is what they said, and I'm going to tie in what they said, right? They said that Turkey is one of those Islamic countries where minorities are relatively better off. We say exactly, and it must continue down this path. It must not merely say that, because we aren't beheading people and cutting off hands, we have fulfilled our mandate. It must actually be proactive and go out there and, in fact, restore the Hagia Sophia mosque as a symbol of a minority community that has been dispossessed of their culture, that has been plastered over and told that, look, I am taking what is yours, I am taking what is dearest to you, I am taking your religion and plastering mine on top of it, because we beat you, we are better than you, we are dominant. We need to, as a secular country, not remain neutral and take proactive steps to ensure that justice is done.
On
Now,
that point.
the first thing that Turkey... Okay, go.
Should you break down the India Gate because it was a result of colonial domination?
No, I don't think so, right? But the India Gate is not also a conflicted, it's not an area which used to be something else before, right? It's not something that was built on top of, say, a memorial to like Indian freedom fighters, right? If that was the case, I would say, yes, tear it down. Now, the idea of art and preserving art. Firstly, I don't think secularism and art are priorities of a government that can be put at par. While we do realize the cultural value of art, we don't think it is necessarily as important as secularism. And if we had to choose between one of the two, we would every day go for secularism. Secondly, we did not say we would destroy this art. We live in the modern world. I'm sure there are techniques where this art can be removed and placed in, say, Muslim museums elsewhere, so that the Hagia Sophia can continue to be a church while not losing its history. This idea that if the Hagia Sophia is converted from a museum to a church, this history will be lost is ridiculous, because remember, almost 1,000 years of history was Islamic history. It's one of the richest civilizations. The Ottomans were artists. You have art all over the world. Okay, go.
Okay, why there's so much concern about like the ISIS necessarily destroying so many figures of art in Syria if it can be restored at all?
What I'm saying is, the way ISIS conducts its business is very different from the way the Turkish government can. So for instance, the Turkish government can remove that art from there instead of destroying it, because that's what ISIS does, and place it elsewhere, which serves the dual purpose of one, preserving that art, and two, reclaiming and giving to this minority community, which has every right to feel insecure in a country which is failing its secular promise, which with leaders like Erdogan is becoming more and more Islamized and in fact regressing, right? It's regressing. So what we've told you so far is, one, it is not enough to be neutral. Two, Turkey's secular promise has failed. And three, there must be proactive effort. We have countered and clashed with them on this assertion that they said that really Christians now don't care because they're cosmopolitan. We believe that this is not true, and we believe that religion still holds an important place in the hearts of people, especially from as devout a sect or as devout a denomination as the Eastern Orthodox Church. Right? This idea that history will be lost is ridiculous, because there are thousands of books that have been written. There are thousands of other sources of history, which even if, and this is an even if argument, because we are saying our first idea is to remove this art in a way where it is preserved. If it can't be, we say, well, that's a loss that we are willing to bear for the sake of secularism, because we believe that secularism is much higher on the mandate of this government than it is in the mandate for preserving art. And they're forgetting that there is Christian art there too, right? You're uncovering new art. So maybe if you think of it simply in artistic terms, you are exchanging art for art, and that's why I am very proud to report.
Mr. Speaker, the worst way to make a minority feel insecure is by overcompensating for the loss in the past and giving it to them in the face that we are giving this back to you, we have taken it away till today, and now this is back and it's yours. Mr. Speaker, the important part in this debate is the question of ownership. Who owns this particular museum? Yeah, this museum is common property, not public or private property. It's the common religious, cultural property of each and every person in Turkey. It showcases a cultural intersection of various other conflicts that have taken place in that place, and the scars in that museum is something which tells a story. You cannot just merely take off these posters, put it somewhere else and call it like, now it's still a story because we still have this art somewhere else. A museum is a museum because it tells you a story. That is how Subodh Gupta makes his museum, by putting taxis of different places, etc. And a museum tells you a story of the civilization. The story of the civilization has its inherent value in the history it depicts. And the history it depicts is something that gives inherent value and to the interpretation, stop doing that, yeah? To the interpretation in the way the Roman Catholic thinks of himself. We think that the Roman Catholic today is not the same as the person who lived in the 500 AD. He is a person who understands that this particular Caliph, which is inside this new museum, is something that used to be something that I believe in, yeah? But this is now a museum, it's common property, it is everybody's. In a scenario where it is given back to him, he really does not know how to associate with it, because he's not the same Catholic Christian. He's a different Catholic Christian in a modern state, and they think they are being secular. What you really do when you go and make a social issue a political one is that you politicize this whole fact as to what your real identity and what your dominant identity in the modern state is. We are not even calling this a monument, for God's sake. We're calling this a museum because we don't think that the existence of both the Caliphs in this place does anything or changes this and makes this religious at all. We think that this has a purely artistic value, and the artistic value should be preserved because it tells a story of a of culture growing and becoming secular and nothing else, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, he gave this example of ISIS. Yeah, the problem with that example is the actor. The actor is ISIS, and therefore that's problematic. The actor here is the Turkish government, and therefore they're secular. Therefore, the move of the Turks when they take off these posters and put some and restore some other art is not the same as ISIS breaking monuments and selling them to other art sellers. Because the connotation over there is that, look, we raped your culture. Over here, it is, look, we are restoring your culture and your identity. They're two completely different connotations. Please don't buy that example. Yeah. Secondly, we tell you this, that a social issue, which is a cultural issue, when politicized, brings divide in identity. Yeah? So secularism works on this principle that the most important identity is not the religious one, it is your cultural unification in the modern state, which is the most important prerogative. Yeah? Therefore, the way you think of yourself is not purely as a religious identity, but the culture that you have associated with yourself and the geopolitical situation over here. We think that who owns this particular museum is the Turkish government, and the Turkish government owning this museum means that the Turkish government's history and the history of the geopolitical setting is more important than both of these religions. I have not even argued how bad these Muslims will feel in Turkey when you do this, because that's a very, very obvious argument, and I'm making it right now. Write it down on the sheets. Yeah? The argument is simple. When you make all these things and when you break down all this art and you reconstruct someone else's art, what you basically do are two, three things. One, you make something which is Christian, not really Christian because it was old Christian, which you don't associate with. It's not the real Christian that you are actually practicing right now. Secondly, it is not Muslim anymore. Thirdly, it's not a museum anymore. And I'll tell you the harms in both. Yeah? When it's not a museum, the inherent value in the art that it previously had is suddenly zilch. There is no artistic value at all. There is no story that is being told. No one understands the story of that place. Only a few number of minorities understand the story of that place, and only they own that property now. Yeah? Who really owns that property is the Turkish government and the Turkish citizens, and we don't think you have the right to take it away from everybody else for one particular minority and make a political situation a religious one and appease some minorities and make them feel more insecure about their own position and make the Muslims really hate them in the future because you did this. Yeah? The next argument is basically this. This is a monument, and what is the value in a monument? How does a monument get its value? Every day that passes is the aging of a particular monument. And the aging of a particular monument and the scars that a monument has gives it a certain amount of inherent value. Each and every change in the age of that particular monument has made that monument what it is now, and now a museum, not even a monument anymore. And that is the history of that place. When you take it back, it's as simple as breaking down the whole monument and putting a church up. Yeah? It's not the same thing anymore. It's repainting. For example, I give you a painting of Stalin, which is really, really old, and you put a big circle and you make it red on his nose and you call him a joker. Is it Stalin anymore? It's not Stalin anymore. It is Stalin's picture, you have put a red dot on and now it looks like a joker. It does not have any historical significance at all. The difference basically is that the story is lost, the narrative of the minority is lost, which is not still the same. You are hurting each and every Muslim who associates with this kind of art. You're hurting everybody who is not really religious. You're making this a religious issue. You're breaking down tolerant communication between communities inside your own country. And this tolerant communication is only bred when multiple religious culture and people who believe in multiple cultures and different religions come to this common place and interact and look at various caliphs and have rumors about the fact that behind that there is something else. When you have a rumor that behind that this was originally something else, it tells you a story about conquest. Yeah, the colonization example is really simple, and a PO is really important. What did colonization do? No man. Yeah, when you have these multiple people, when you have the whole West coming and colonizing you and building infrastructure of the sort which symbolizes their dominance in your country, you not only are a colony anymore, but now when the colony gets independence, should they go ahead and reclaim? How should you reclaim property? How should you think of property? And that was my argument, one singular big argument which they really won't understand, is that the only way you should understand public property is of it having a common heritage with each and every person. That is what true secularism is. By making it a religious issue, you run away from secularism by appeasing a certain number of minorities, bring religious backlash, insult some people, make them feel insecure, etc. Take away the artistic value of what this is, change it from the story that it is telling you to something else, and for all these reasons I think this is a big problem. Lastly, like a big example is the Jallianwala Bagh example. We go there to look at the bullets.
in the wall. The bullets in the wall tell you the story of what this is and what this was and what we think about it. We won't take away the bullets, reconstruct that whole thing and tell you that this was Jallianwala Bagh before that particular massacre. That massacre is something that tells you the story, and the story is really, really integral. Each and every story in this process is something that makes this place important. The importance of this place may be, according to all the facts that they have told you, something got to do with Christianity. They can think of this as a Christian place, they can come here and worship, we really won't stop them. Yeah? But when I change this landscape of this place, they won't be able to identify this place anymore. That's the difference. If they come here and look at this as the church, thank God they did that. Thank you.
Madam Speaker, before I tell you what the Hagia Sophia really stands for and why it's important to in fact equalize what is increasingly an unequal field, let me begin with a few rebuttals, Madam Speaker. I think they try to run away with the characterization of Christianity today as it exists in Western Europe and America, which is one of principally where religion has in fact been away, not of traditional societies like Turkey, especially the Eastern Orthodox Church, where people happen to be increasingly devout. We tell you, Madam Speaker, that it's especially important when you look at what's happening recently, where over the past 20 years, the AK party led by Erdogan has increasingly snatched away religious liberties from minorities in terms of the kind of funding they used to be given by the state, no longer funding given by the funding is only given to madrasas. The fact that there is an increased visibility of Islamization in the political sphere, we tell you that it becomes that much more important for them to conserve their religious liberty. And Madam Speaker, we tell you that the most important symbol of that religious liberty, of them being treated as equals in a modern Turkey, happens to be the Hagia Sophia, and we tell you exactly why that is the case. We tell you, Madam Speaker, is that Orthodox Christians now care about their religious liberty, about the Hagia Sophia, about the narrative of oppression more than they have since any time after 1913.
Why?
Since 1913. We tell you, Madam Speaker, also, and they talk about art and about how ISIS is destroying art. This is going to be a clinical affair. You're going to take this into another museum. They're murals on a plaster, for heaven's sake. It's not about things about you breaking down a certain pillar, which really can't be simulated elsewhere. We tell you that if you take the Mona Lisa from the Louvre to somewhere else, it really won't diminish its inherent value, the beauty of the art that is present. But more importantly, I think their point is about how this art represents some kind of sympathetic unity, diversity value, because ultimately both Muslim art and Christian art together. We tell you great, but the intention of this was never for it to be syncretic. The intention that you're trying to portray is that it's like a bastion of secularism, of syncretism. We tell you it's anything but that, because the original intention was to in fact take away what existed, which was Christian motifs, and replace it with someone else. The narrative that in fact is that one religion happens to be illegitimate, that it's one big fuck you from Islam to Christianity, and that's something they really haven't engaged with. And what I personally find offensive, Mr. Speaker, when they come and equate this with the India Gate, because the India Gate is a testament to the bravery of all Indian soldiers who lost their lives in the Second World War. We tell you that it doesn't have to be a symbol of direct cultural domination the way it does, because in fact the British never took over land from us and happened to oppress us directly. We tell you that anyway, when you talk about something like the Jallianwala Bagh, it would be an apposite example if the Jallianwala Bagh was still in British possession, and they were refusing to give it back to us. But now we already have possession over the Jallianwala Bagh, which is why we choose to remember it. Instead, if you rather have us do what with the Jallianwala Bagh. But they tell you, Mr. Speaker, also about how it's important to for history to be remembered, both and especially for the minorities, something we agree with. We tell you a museum happens to be value neutral. It happens to be dead. It is a testament to history, but not a live one. And that's not okay, especially when the history, the legacy of this cultural domination lives on. And I think they've gainsaid entirely the minority population which in fact exists in Turkey. The Coptic Christians which live in Turkey, the Eastern Orthodox Church, which has a huge fucking following. I really don't know how you don't know that Eastern Turkey, 80% of Eastern Turkey, happens to still in fact live under Byzantine culture, who are deeply religious. They are nothing like Christians living abroad who are cosmopolitan. We tell you, Madam Speaker, that instead what we want, and this is especially true for the minority, we tell you that instead when you convert it into what it actually was, it's a more powerful reminder of what it actually stood for. It's a testament of what really history was. And it's right now it stands as a symbol of their oppression. We'd rather have it stand as a symbol of accommodation, of what modern Turkey should in fact stand for, while also being mindful of what its history actually was. And we tell you that its history will not in fact be forgotten. Look at from the minority perspective. Right now they know what their history is, that we were oppressed, hence it's important to remember the Hagia Sophia, yes. But wouldn't it be better if they remembered it along with all of this as also a symbol of how important they are in modern Turkey, that they have in fact had a rightful place in modern Turkey, and all of this is obviously going to go go on with their past. It's also ridiculous when they talk about the backlash, like you're replacing old Christianity with new Christianity. Again, you don't really understand what the Eastern Roman Church is. That form of Christianity still fucking lives on. It's not as if all Christians in like Turkey right now happen to be Catholics, for heaven's sake. But tell me, Madam Speaker, why it doesn't really compare. This is all of the analysis that they really miss when we like compare it to the Dome of the Rock, where there's actually a theological dispute in fact going on. That's not the case with the Church of the Hagia Sophia. The entire message was purely political and nothing else. And we've analyzed this to you in so many different ways. That Christianity happens to be inferior, and all its members are. And we tell you that it's the emblem of this narrative of Islamic domination, the practical consequences of which Raharsh has said, which is like the oppression of all non-Muslims. And we tell you that hence there is a very direct, unequal relation which existed from Mehmet's time in 1236 to, in fact, like 1913. And we tell you in 1913 he wanted to change that. The secularization project was all about taking away Islam's grip on political society, which, like Ataturk believed, was making Turkey stagnate, was making it unscientific. We tell you that as long as this narrative of like Islam being dominant lives on, because remember, Mr. Speaker, what you're doing is to change like the unnatural, like the unequal situation. It's like reservation, or even like ISIS, for heaven's sake. Like you can't deal with it only in terms of formal equality, because like in India you can't be indifferent to like caste. You can't say caste doesn't exist. You have to acknowledge that the position previously was unequal, and the position previously before 1913 was deeply unequal, where like no Christian could ever compare to like the political power held by a Muslim, like seen by the fact that Christians were generally oppressed, had to pay far higher taxes. All of those things that like are just plainly intuitive. We tell you that in an unequal sphere, it's not enough to be neutral. You have to necessarily apply a countervailing force of equality, and you do that by stepping in and making things equal. And we tell you that that is only done when you demolish this narrative of Islamic oppression. And this is done. They really have the understood example of ISIS, because we aren't comparing modern Turkey to ISIS. We're comparing the Sultan, the Caliphate, to ISIS, right? Because what will happen instead, like it's like tomorrow the secular state of Iraq takes over all like the Yazidi and the Shia shrines, and it says, okay, you know what? We're going to take this over as state property. You find your own places of worship. Well, the Sunnis already have their places of worship, right? So I think that's inherently unequal, because making things equal is also about making things which were unequal in the past, changing the wrongs that in fact happened. And we tell you, Madam Speaker, that in 1913 we did not go enough, which is why the Turkish Revolution failed. We tell you that this narrative of domination has existed ever since, which is why a bigot like Recep Tayyip Erdogan comes into power and happens to canalize all of this like political Islam into such like nefarious things. And we told you what that has resulted in. It's demolished this like idea of Turkey as a model state, because you can no longer posit Turkey as the ideal situation for a Saudi Arabia, for a majority Sunni state to ever reach a position where minorities can also ever dream of holding political power, which is equal to mainstream Sunni majority, to Sunni Muslims. And for all of those reasons, Madam Speaker, we don't think they really stand a chance with beg to propose.
For his beautifully protected speech, before I analyze as to why they have lost this debate, right? They've made some primary arguments that we're going to dispel in the course of my speech, right? What have been their basic arguments? Firstly, they try to characterize to you a certain sort of like robbery that was committed on the Christians on the 6th century, right? And they think that that sense of robbery and that sense of harm and that sense of loss still exists within Turkish citizens and Turkish Christian citizens. And to cure that loss and cure that feeling of laws, we need to now make ramifications and make changes to the Hagia Sophia, right? Now we tell you there are certain things that they need to establish first, right? We think that history has always offended certain communities, and that is what we were telling, right? That history has always offended certain communities, and they have to establish why that sense of that feeling of offense is still continuing in the present day, right? They have to establish why that feeling of loss from the 6th century is still perpetuating today in 2015, right? Which is something that they have absolutely not done, right? If you see your sheet, you'll see like some 10 words from the Prophet's speech where they talk about like giving more money to the madrasas, right? We think that is not enough, and we think that it is too late for them to come and tell us that there is a requirement to appease the Christians in present-day Turkey, which has been their burden if they take this kind of argumentation that we now need to appease the Christians, right? I'll take you later. So that is something that they have not done, right? And this became the premise of their characterization of what kind of secularism the Turkish state needs to follow, right? They said we're not like India, which dissociates itself from different communities, but we take unto ourselves a proactive secularism to make sure that everybody feels okay, right? But what is the need for this proactive secularism? Either they have to tell me one thing, that the status quo in Turkey's proactive secularism, in this case where So Christians will not feel isolated at all. Christians will not be marginalized at all because they're already proactively secular. So there would be no need to make changes to the Hagia Sophia. So when they say we need to be proactively secular, their premise is that Christians are feeling isolated, something which they have not established at all, right? And we think that as long as they don't show us what is this pressing need, what is this pressing social need into the secular democratic state of Turkey, that you need to suddenly appease Christians, we don't think that they have justified or fulfilled their burden of establishing why changes need to be brought to the Hagia Sophia, right? In contrast, what did we do, right? We showed you that if you do something like this, there will be ramification and there will be cultural and religious backlashes which will take you in a situation where you will have to necessarily deal with these community problems, with these religious problems, right? We told you that there are certain problems when you do this, right? And this brings me to their argumentation of how religious identity exists, especially with respect to Christians, right? Okay, we agree that Turkey has like devout Christians and we don't have any problem with that, right? But we have to understand something, that what does this feeling of being a devout Christian have to do with relation to the Hagia Sophia, right? The Hagia Sophia, as the motion so clearly states, is a museum and has been a symbol of secularism for so many years, right? And Rajesh and Samit clearly characterized to you and established so clearly that the perception of an average Turkish citizen when he looks at the Hagia Sophia is a symbol of history, is a symbol of culture, is a symbol of what Turkey is today, right? So when Ataturk came and put some Muslim inscriptions over like and some Christian art, what it started as a foundation for the secular state that Turkey is today, right? And that is something that it acts as a reference point for Turkish citizens today to understand what their state has gone through, and by diminishing this reference point, you basically leave like Turkish citizens in a state of limbo where they don't know whether the Hagia Sophia is like a normal Christian church or whether like there was something that had happened and then we took it back, right? It loses its significance and loses the meaning that it had to the people, right? And we told you that there's a certain problems with this, right? That the average person prioritizes his cultural identity over the religious identity, right? I'll give you an example, right? Are the Turkish Christians like proceeding towards a secessionist motive? No, they don't. They still want to remain in Turkey, which means that even if they are Christians, they still identify with the fact that they are Turkish citizens. And Hagia Sophia, primarily before being Islamic or Christian, is something which is Turkish, right? Which is what Rajesh argued when he spoke to you about community ownership, and that this belongs to the community and not to a particular citizen or like a particular religion, right? And I think there's a problem symbolically when an Islamic like when a state which Islamic majority goes ahead and takes out the Islamic inscription and gives a Christian church to a Christian society, right? We think that this action has a symbolical problem because we don't think that another religion should have the ability to give one religion something that it owns, right? We think that is problematic because then the Christians have been in a second that the Christians have the feeling that something which was supposed to be inherently theirs is by now being returned. We think that something that was in 537 AD inherently theirs has now achieved a meaning, has now become something which is now belongs to everybody.
Don't you think that the fact that in 1913 modern Turkey did not agree with the statement of oppression, did not disagree with the statement of oppression, is actually acceptance of the unequal status that existed for Christians?
So to that extent, I think, could you please repeat quickly?
Yeah, ma'am, the fact that in 1913 the modern state of Turkey did not disagree with this form, this symbol of oppression, it actually means that it accepts it as being legitimate. The status quo actually continues into the future.
They have to prove why 1930 still continues to 2015, right? And this is our entire line of argumentation. That even if in 1930 it appeared as a symbol of oppression, they have to prove why that is still the existing picture of that, right? And we think even if the idea is that art can have several perceptions that it has to people, right? Side opposition sees India Gate as a symbol of colonialism, and they think it's about the bravery of a citizen. In either case, we think it should remain. We think it should not be demolished. So even if certain factions of the Turkish state may interpret it as a symbol of oppression, we think it still retains certain meanings and certain important images for the people, which we think is extremely important, right? Now coming back quickly, what else have they spoken to you about, right? They've spoken to you about how that this was a political move done in the history, right? And we think that is important. We think that is what makes it important. That it is this attached meaning, right? We don't think that people can pass value judgments before one type of art over the other type of art, and that is essentially because they can't pass value judgments over the Eiffel Tower, over the Taj Mahal, because they both symbolize different things, and that symbol is something that is what makes them what they are. And they have not shown to you any pressing social need or any need at all to prove that why need to go ahead and synthetically change that meaning for the larger Turkish citizens, right? And especially when we have showed to you and enlisted so many harms that may come out of it, they need to tell us that what is the existing status quo that necessarily requires the Turkish state to go ahead and do this thing, right? And that is something that they have completely failed to do. And without that, we don't think that they have a case that they can fulfill. And we realize that even if that Christians feel abandoned in 6th century AD, they need to tell us why temporarily that still matters.
Do agree today that Turkey should move towards some form of system that integrates the various cultures that exist between it. And therefore, on your sheets, whichever side answers the question of cultural integration being achieved in a better manner wins this debate. It isn't a question of facts that are thrown at you, or questions of of narratives that are thrown at you, or context that's thrown at you. But let's take a look at what side proposition had to give us in terms of contextual matter, right? They told us about devout Eastern Roman or erstwhile Eastern Roman Christians and how they live today, right? But they failed to engage with us on a temporal context, right? They simply assume that they're not likely to change, right? And we think that's a wrong assumption in itself. But even if we buy into the narrative that the devout Christians that existed at that time and were so affected by that spirit and therefore adopted the Hagia Sophia as their symbol, still in fact are as devout as they were that time, it is important for them to answer how this particular move is not a move of patronage by the Turkish government, which is necessarily that controls the majoritarian Islamic government. We've told you that this is necessarily the way in which subaltern language is shaped, and that's how you must necessarily adjudicate your debate, right? We think that there are greater chances of cultural inflammation within a political Turkey, a Turkey that's attempting to be secular, if devout Christians are faced with the proposition of receiving something back, right, in terms of the symbolism, right? And they haven't engaged with us on that. They simply ignore that aspect of the debate, assuming that devout Christians will respond in the same way as they assume it to be. We think that there are two narratives. In either narrative, the consequences are bad for the ends of secularism, right? Either they will respond adversely and reinforce cultural divides that may or may not exist, and if we assume the narrative that they're in fact cosmopolitan, we believe that their responses will not be the same. They look at the Hagia Sophia in a different manner, right? But let's look at the other ideas that we introduced as opposition, right? Something that they failed to engage with in the arrogance of their own prop case, right? We told them about cultural ownership, right? And how when you deconstruct a museum, a neutral venue, which they agree, right, into its constituent religious elements, right, it doesn't necessarily lead to something that's like a feeling of redemption, right? And that's the necessary linkage that they fail to prove to us, right? They need to show us, right, that their context that they established in two speeches and wasted their time doing so necessarily changes the entire realm of secularism as a whole, and that this process is in fact intrinsic to that, right? Because we don't believe by changing the Hagia Sophia, the entire cultural context of secularism changes by itself, right? We believe that in a balance of harms and benefits, there are more harms that are likely to accrue rather than their entire burden of saying that restoring the Hagia Sophia will in fact change the entire cultural paradigm of secularism that exists between the state. Their entire context serves no purpose to establish that particular link, and we think that this cannot simply win on that narrative, right? We've also told you, right, it's very, very important to understand that cultural integration as a whole is not achieved vis-a-vis breaking down symbols of war and symbolism. And if cultural integration is the ultimate objective, it is very important for the identity of Turkey today to understand how to navigate its future political system vis-a-vis understanding its past. A past that is ridden with conflict and conquest. A past that shows that anything can happen and there are certain consequences of having that war. Which means that if they don't remember that, they cannot shape their identity today, or they cannot understand who they are because they necessarily need to be culturally integrated, right? And like Asmita clearly told you, their aim is not to secede if they were so devout about that, right? Despite being devout, and if you were to buy into that narrative, if they want to be devout, they also want to live in a modern Turkish society that aims to integrate everybody. In that case, we need to find a method that necessarily balances all that. And in that case, we believe that the harms that we've shown in this case are likely to further regress the progress towards a political system that can be navigated by Turkish communities living between that, right? We believe that the idea of patronage is something that they failed to engage with throughout this debate. The idea of the symbolism of something that gives back. The idea of reinforcing cultural markers, right? And we don't think that they can win this debate by simply looking at Wikipedia in prep time, right? We don't think that that's how this necessarily works. They need to take that to its logical conclusion and show us, right, how in the present temporal framework the reactions are likely to lead to cultural integration. We believe that we've run the principal debate on-side opposition. We've told you simple harms and consequences, right? And we believe that again, in the arrogance of their own contextual framework, thinking that that's going to work in establishing all the other logical conclusions that they needed to do in terms of harms and benefits, that they failed to do that.
not, or the objective of this debate was not to prove why or the method through which we should achieve cultural integration. We don't think side opposition is even proved by cultural integration as any sort of value. The way we've identified burden in this debate was to prove, and we think this was off burden, that the best case for secularism was to keep the Hagia Sophia as a museum. And therefore this was a debate about Turkish secularism. This was a debate about how to uphold Ataturk's ideals and whether Hagia Sophia even falls part of that discussion. And instead, what the half-baked arguments that we think side opposition has presented you with in signs of desperation are, first, we don't think side government has given you a pressing need, except what we spent close to 15 minutes on in terms of context, in terms of apparent Wikipedia readings, was simply to understand the significance of Hagia Sophia, was simply to understand why are the Orthodox Christians different from the rest, and therefore what sort of importance did the Hagia Sophia have for them. And the only way that we can prove in this debate that secularism and Hagia Sophia necessarily fall within the same discourse is to understand the symbolic significance of the Hagia Sophia. And we don't see how side opposition could have debated in the absence of the context that we gave them. Ridiculous. An absurd argument that they gave us, and we think that this is really where the whip kind of completely conceded to the debate, was where she said, yeah, you know, the minorities aren't looking to secede from the state, and therefore we think they're kind of okay with everything. If the only way for minorities to express angst with the state was to secede, then we'd be looking at a very, very different world, and pretty much ask anyone in Kashmir about secession, they'll tell you about that. In terms of an understanding of what flop case was in this debate, what we told you very clearly was that the Orthodox Church viewed the Hagia Sophia as a symbol around which they used to rally, as a hugely significant religious symbol, and that the way that this was taken over was simply a purely political move as a sign of dominance. And there was no clash from this side on that in terms of why was it taken over, right? Which is really what they should have done. And instead, therefore, what we debate with in terms of context is that, is this purely political move? Can we just ignore it under the guise of, in their scenario, can we just ignore it under the guise of the fact that people have forgotten about it, right? That's really the entire argument about bringing back memories or regressing memories, which is just absurd, right? And the reason why we tell you that that is absurd is because not only have people not forgotten about it, in terms of the fact that the Christian orthodoxy remains incredibly active within Turkish discourse, in terms of trying to establish their rights, in terms of telling the world that they are being oppressed on a daily basis under Erdogan's hugely Islamic reign. Not only have we also established to you the fact that there has been an increased Islamization in terms of the pressing need that side opposition wanted government to give them. I spent close to 3.5 minutes of my speech explaining to you what happened after the demise of Ataturk, what happened to Turkey's secular agenda. And we told you that not only has it substantively been weaned away, Turkey remains and wishes to remain a model state for the rest of the Muslim world, and that the only way, Madam Speaker, for us to do this was to uphold our ideals of secularism. And therefore, formally, until we abandon this ideal, which we have not done, we need to go back to the ideals that an unequal platform for all minorities must first be rectified in the guise of ensuring equality. And therefore, we tell you, Madam Speaker, that 900 years of oppression, 900 years of symbolic dominance of Islam and political dominance, social dominance, must be rectified by active moves from the state and not simply remaining neutral. And therefore, in my remaining 40 seconds, what I hope to provide you with, Madam Speaker, is an understanding of what side opposition has really told you. They have told you that we should not bring back regressive memories because, well, we're not sure. They identified burden of this debate as cultural integration, which was really not discussed in 6 substantive speeches. They did not give us a value of cultural integration, and they did not really tackle us on why secularism is not the crux of this debate. Instead, what we gave you was tremendous amount of context with regard to the Christian Orthodox Church, the symbolic value of the Hagia Sophia, the fact that in 1200s it was taken over as a purely political move, and therefore it is in the guise of the secular that we must take back the Hagia Sophia.